some people in the our Santos we've got a couple of people. Okay, let's go.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening, good evening, good evening. Welcome to the Saucer Yacht Club. This is the continuation of our monthly speaker series. This event is a very special event because this book has yet to be published. It'll be published on May the 5th. So special arrangements for a book that will make the New York Times bestseller list, I can guarantee you that. This book is here available. David Helvarg is here. He is the executive director of this organization. Been so for 20 years doing ocean conservancy, research, etc. Their boat, the Queen, is tied up. It's a former World War II patrol boat, beautiful teak on it, made of pine, and recommend that you take a tour of it after the lecture. It's available to go aboard, etc. The boat will also be out in the bay this coming summer for educational purposes, people going out for tours, etc. And there is a sign-up sheet at the table for the book sales for you to put your email down, etc. David Schwartz, a member here at the Yacht Club, is the, if you will, the local contact for continuation of boat rides and research, etc. My name is Tom Kowalski. I'm one of the staff counselors here, and I just want to do a little housekeeping things first of all. If you haven't ordered, please order your food ASAP. The kitchen closes at 7. So I know some people here have not ordered, and Santos will get to that, etc. Number 2, if you're familiar with our restrooms, they're out. If you're not familiar with our restrooms, they're right off the foyer, right and left. And we have the speaker in May will be the mayor of Sausalito, Stephen Woodside, who will be talking about the high water levels in Sausalito, not only the king tides, but the general topic of ocean rising, flood control, etc., etc. In June, there's a PhD who will be speaking to us about shark research on the bay. And she is currently doing research on the smaller sharks that we will see off of Angel Island, Point Blunt, etc. And she does a lot of that research, and we'll be talking about that. She also will be inviting people out on her research boat to view. So, without further ado, please welcome Mr. David Helvarg.
Thank you. There's the book. I thought we'd start with a little show and tell, which is a 2-minute intro here.
In my book, Forest of the Sea, I set out to begin a journey and tell a story of one of the largest marine habitats on Earth. A wilderness bigger than the Amazon rainforest, a cold and challenging saltwater realm that can also be an entrancing cathedral of light and life, a vibrant center of wonder and warning in our rapidly changing seas. The world's kelp forests are as mysterious as the deepest ocean trenches, even though they cover the nearshore waters of more than a quarter of our global coastline, from the Arctic to South Australia, Norway to the tip of Latin America. Hundreds of millions of people live within a short dive's distance of kelp forests without knowing much or anything about them. Seeing mounds of pungent, fly-covered seaweed, some of it kelp, few would imagine that these forests of the sea produce $500 billion of goods and services a year. These range from edible marine wildlife, including salmon, cod, rockfish, and herring, that depend on kelp, to emulsifiers used in ice cream and cosmetics, to powerful storm and coastal protection, even much of the oxygen we breathe. It turns out that kelp forests are one of the essential sources and crucibles of life on our blue marble planet. And yes, after years of diving in wild kelp and seeing its decline, even as seaweed farming has become a growing part of our global food security, I couldn't find any media coverage on the links between kelp climate and the future of our ocean. That's why I decided to write my book, Forest of the Sea, The Remarkable Life and Imperiled Future of Kelp. that's taken me on a wild adventure from a lobster boat in Maine to an underwater shark frenzy in Micronesia. From being alongside divers snatching sea urchins in the cold, murky waters of Northern California to visiting a sleek aluminum biorefinery turning algae into jet fuel on Turkey's Black Sea coast. So join me on a literary nonfiction adventure as we dive into the forest of the sea.
Okay, and this is my first book talk, so unfortunately, this urban hellhole of Sausalito, but I think we'll manage to make it through. I open it, every chapter's got its poem. I open it with all dripping in tangles green, cast up by a lonely sea, if pure for that, O weed, bitterer too are ye. That's Herman Melville's The Tuft of Kelp. As Tom mentioned, I'm executive director of Blue Frontier. We set it up about 20 years ago as an ocean conservation group that wants to mobilize people to be effective in protecting our oceans that are most of our planet. 20 years later, we're also, our Commodore there, David Schwartz, is our board president. Behind him, Steve is our captain. We have this beautiful 48-foot William Hand designed motor sailor that also served the nation in World War II, whether the owner wanted to or not. It became a submarine patrol boat off the East Coast. They got rid of the underpowered gasoline engine and put in a diesel engine from a landing craft. So how did we get here? That's a good question. I'm still not entirely certain, but one thing was, in part I started Blue Frontier because, I always loved the ocean, and then I got distracted by the movements and moments of my youth and became a journalist and spent the next 30 years in this schizophrenic state of going off to cover wars and epidemics so I could come home and body surf. And when I finally did my second book, Blue Frontier, in the spirit of, which was about the state of U.S. oceans and the spirit of recycling, I turned it into a nonprofit. And a lot of what I wanted to do was promote what I call the Blue Beat, the idea that the only resource in the ocean not fully exploited is good investigative reporting. So I've done a couple of books, one Rescue Wars about the U.S. Coast Guard. I thought they were the only one of our armed services that's like actually under-resourced and underrepresented in our public awareness. And it's great. Somebody's doing a presentation here on the smaller sharks. They don't get the respect, although of course with California, white sharks are the apex predators outside the kelp, and sea otters are the apex predators in the kelp beds. Although one of the surfers that I interviewed in the book was like, we hang out in the kelp because like the otters, it keeps us safe from the sharks. Well, not true. The whites also are running through the kelp. I saw a baby white down in San Diego when we were free diving for the book. And the book kind of got going because, again, it's we have so little reporting on what's going on in the other 71% of our planet, which is sort of understandable. We have this bipedal air-breathing bias against most life on the planet. On any given day, there are 8 billion of us, and about 30 million of us are then out on the other 71% of the planet that's salt water. So as a result, we don't, make the connections between like ocean and climate that, for example, with the kelp, it generates, $500 billion a year of goods and services. People, I'm gonna probably write a piece shortly on the ocean climate issues nobody knows much about, which is kelp, coral, and krill. People, if you say kelp, they might think seaweed piling up on the shore. People know coral's in trouble, they don't know exactly why. You say krill, they have no idea what you're talking about. Unless they're taking omega-3s, fish oil, and krill oil. But the kelp sort of intrigued me because I've been diving in it on and off for 40 years. In the course of this book, Dave and I went to Palau, because I got a chapter called Kelp is the New Coral. And they actually are sort of the, the ebony and ivory of the ocean. I mean, coral is an animal that lives on the skeletons of generations of other polyps that have come before it. And it loves, and thrives in clear, low nutrient, warm waters. And it needs herbivores, it needs sea turtles and parrotfish to eat the algae that could otherwise overwhelm it. Whereas kelp is an algae. It likes cold, nutrient-rich waters, which kind of make them obscure. The first dive I did for this book, which was more a training dive down in Monterey, didn't even put it in the book. It was about 2-foot visibility. Basically, we got down there, and it's like, you're not quite blind. It's like you're up close with an impressionistic painting. It's like kind of brown and white, and then I could just make out the black flippers of my dive buddy, and at one point I had to sort of grab him to make sure we were. And then of course we surfaced, and then we had to do the kelp crawl because we surfaced right in the middle of the canopy. And I think, I talked to Sylvia Earle, who's in the book, who started out with seaweed. She's a phycologist in her early years, which is, to be a phycologist, you need a certain psychology because it's the study of algae. I said, why everybody know about coral and not kelp? She said, people like to be warm. They like to get in with a coral and it's warm and beautiful, which it is, but it's also delicate. You can't touch it because, it's all these polyps are very sensitive. And Tom Ford, who I went, diving down in Southern California, they restored 80 acres down there. I dove through 10 of them that have come back. He made the point that, kelp diving is a full contact sport. You get tangled up in it, you got to back up, you can't pull away from it, but it's like celery, you can break it. And it's fairly amazing. I mean, as I mentioned, what people don't know about the kelp forest is they're extensive. Even with the decline of about 50% of the last 50 years, there's still like 2.8 million acres, covering almost a third of the world's coastlines. That's larger than the Amazon. And like the Amazon, it's a source of oxygen. Kelp and seagrasses and mangroves between them. These algae and plants generate about 20% of our oxygen. And then they're the macroalgae and the marine plants, and then the microalgae, the phytoplankton in the ocean, generate another 50% of our oxygen through photosynthesis. Nobody thinks, oh yeah, the ocean also gives us 70% of the air we breathe, because it makes sense. I mean, 71% of our photosynthesizing planet is ocean. And so I, as I said, I've been diving on and off in the kelp for years, but then about 10 years ago now, I just, my last book is, which also have some over there, The Golden Shore, California's Love Affair with the Ocean. It's my most optimistic book. It's, we're always looking for how do you grow the solutions quicker than the problems. And after being too long in DC and moving back to California, I realized, whoa, California is the solution. California is, 40 million people, the world's 4th largest economy, and we're doing good by our coast and ocean. And part of that is because, I think, because we have California's got a sense of entitlement. Our beaches, our coast belong to us all. And we have a diversity of coastal interests. We have the largest port complex in the Western Hemisphere. We have a great range of marine science centers. We have surfers. We have fishermen. We have, this incredible diversity. It's like a family meal. We have all these arguments and we come out with good endpoints. The Navy, the Navy when they fire missiles from Space Force down in Southern California, they have an agreement with the Coastal Commission not to set off the Antarctic boosters during seal pupping season on the Channel Islands. So, California has this amazing connection. And the book came out in 2014, and unfortunately you can't protect the ocean in one state, even our state. Because 2014 was also the beginning of the blob. chapter 3 is the blob, the zombies, and the algae labs. And the blob was a marine heat wave that, again, people don't know, 90% of our anthropogenic heating, 90% of the heat from the burning of fossil fuels is absorbed by the ocean. And so the ocean has gotten hotter and hotter. Now there's these global marine heat waves. Last year, the ocean, according to NOAA and 30 other institutions, found that the ocean's hotter than it's ever been in the historic record, going back to the 1860s, 1880s, sorry. And these marine heat waves come in, and the blob was a massive marine heat wave that came in between 2014 and 2017. It lowered the upwellings of California and warmed up the waters, which is uncomfortable to the kelp. But what really took them out was a 2019 study found that warming also supercharged sea star wasting disease, which is they've just discovered it was a bacteria. It was periodically in the ocean, but it became massive. And starting in 2013, basically 90% of all the starfish on the West Coast died off very quickly. Basically within days to weeks, their arms go up, and then their arms start to fall off, and then they deflate and become like basically a splotch on the ocean bottom. And among them was the sunflower sea star, which is the largest, most aggressive. It's a cannibalistic 14-armed sea star that can grow to the size of a bald eagle, 13 pounds. And where we've gotten rid of the other predators that feed on the herbivores that feed on the kelp, in Northern California, the bull kelp, we've gotten rid of the otters. Chapter 2's otter things, we had a whole otter wars. The Chinese opened up their markets in the 1780s, right when capitalism was really emerging as a global force in Europe, and so we ended up with the Americans, the British, and the Russians selling what they call royal fur to the ruling class in China, a dynastic class, and it became very popular. We wiped out several million otters between basically 1785, when Captain Cook found a big bunch of them off British Columbia, and 1900. We took them down. So the otters are no longer there. They're the keystone predators for the kelp forest. Until we wipe them out. So in Northern California, we also overfish some of the other big predators like the lobster and the big sea bass. And so the only predator left was this sunflower sea star. And when they disappeared in 2014, all the little, not the big commercial red urchin, which there's a commercial fishery for, but the little guys, the little purple urchins that hid in the rough bottom and little hidey holes staying away, they realized there were no predators. They came out, they multiplied 10,000%, and they ate all the kelp. They took down the kelp forest, which are habitat for 1,000 species, and they were replaced by urchin barrens. And that's what we still, 10 years later, mostly have for 300 miles in Northern California into Southern Oregon. It's these massive urchin barrens. And, and now people are working on restoration. I guess relative good news is that it's a lot easier to restore a kelp forest than a coral reef. I mean, I have friends I've been with in Florida, and they plant a fragment of coral onto a dead reef, cement it on, and they get very excited that if that branching coral grows 12 inches in a year. Where I was down at Concord in the Bay Foundation off of Palos Verdes, once they clear out the urchins, they find they don't even have to. A lot of people are like planting coral kelp spore, but they found a natural restoration of kelp spore, and it can grow 100 feet in a year. So these guys, they're the bamboo of the ocean. They can come back if you make the resource commitment. As I say, it's taken 10 years and about $6 million for the Bay Foundation to bring back 80 acres in Southern California. If you take it seriously, if you recognize that there's $500 billion of resources there in terms of coastal storm protection, in terms of marine wildlife, you say, what do I care? But you're probably eating a lot of it. And salmon, I opened the book in Alaska with salmon and cod and herring they're all dependent in their life cycle on the kelp forests. So the South Koreans recognize that. Their fisheries ministry commits $29 million a year to restoring kelp, and to date they've restored 50,000 acres with the aim to restore 125,000 acres by 2030, so 4 years from now. So it's possible to bring it back. The problem is the marine heat waves keep coming, and as this before, Northern California is like one of ground zeros for the loss of kelp. The other one is Tasmania and the eastern shore of Australia. And again, it's different effects in different places. So there it was, the East Australian current was altered by climate change. It's a warm current, it came down. It also brought the spore of urchins that pretty much between the heat and the urchins there, they lost their kelp years ago. And the scientist who's down there told me, you know, we can restore kelp, it's expensive, but if we don't get off fossil fuels by the end of the century, we lose the corals, we lose the kelp. Last year, 85%. I covered the first coral bleaching in 1997 to 1998. Starting in 2025, we had the 4th global coral bleaching events, and last year, 85% of all the world's corals were experiencing some level of bleaching. So with that in mind, of course, Dave and I and my nephew had to go out to Palau for research purposes and do some diving with, you know, giant mantas and red snapper. We were having a breeding moment, about 10,000 of them, and just, you know, in groups of 500, they just run to the surface, and then they like release their sperm and their eggs, and then they like flash down back to the bottom like they've embarrassed themselves. And it's just these spawning events and seeing, you know, live healthy coral. I ended the book, I went back out with the Bay Foundation to Catalina, where the giant kelp's doing pretty well, and we went diving there, and you know, it was like, you're down in the kelp and there's like a 4-foot bat ray right below us, and of course the kelp grabs Tom by his flipper, so he's like, spooks the bat ray, which comes right up in front of my face, and I gotta duck its shark tail, and then there's, you know, there's harbor seals chasing us around, and we get out, and we, you know, we're in these warm, heavy semi-dry suits, so we're floating around like dogs or like otters because we're on our bellies and having fun. Get back out of the boat, and suddenly the 750-pound bull sea lion swims by with this huge scar on his sock, reminding us that, you know, that we're not the top predator in these waters, which is fine. I always say, you know, if there's not something bigger and meaner than you're out there, it's not really wilderness. So we have this incredible wilderness off California. We have these kelp forests off everywhere where you got cold water. I mean, they've just created marine sanctuaries to protect kelp, wild kelp off the southern cone of Latin America, Argentina, and Chile. We're giving, May 7th, we're having our 12th Peter Benchley Ocean Awards down at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And the international award goes to the president of the Azores, who's just established, I think, the largest marine protected area in Europe, which covers a lot of cold water kelp. So, you know, protect the kelp, restore it where necessary, do the research that's needed, and also, you know, make the transition to clean energy, because we're not going to save the kelp unless we get past our fossil fuel. You know, and again, you know, coal and oil were great energy systems for the 16th and 19th century. We're in the 21st, we need to move on. It's like I've been out with BP and others on their oil rigs off California and in the Gulf of Mexico. And I think it's like the whaling fleets. You know, it's time for the roughnecks and roustabouts. We respect them as part of our maritime history, but we can move on. And in their cases, they can all become linesmen and turbine technicians. It's an easy transition from offshore oil to offshore wind. So all of these are possibilities. I think what I try to do in the book is look at the history, which goes back again. It was the kelp highway that humans settled the Americas for generations. They thought it was a land bridge. but now the archaeology shows that the land bridge, the ice only, the glaciers only opened up 14,000 years ago, and we have human settlements that are 25,000 years old. People basically came along the marine highway, which in 2007 scientists named the Kelp Highway. And it's still there. It doesn't go from the Russian Far East to Baja anymore, but it's still extensive along California, Oregon, Washington State. People don't know the Kelp Highway. They don't know the great African sea forest that is actually expanding because they're winners and losers in climate change. They don't know the sea forest at the end of the world, which is 30% of the kelp is. Well, it's funny, I was talking to an Argentine activist, and she says, we have 30% of the world's kelp. I'm going, that doesn't sound right. I go, are you including the Malvinas? Yeah. Say, okay, well, the Falklands are separate to me, so they have 15%, you have 20%, that's still impressive. But it's, Norway, Svalbard, the archipelago north of Norway, it's because the Arctic is warming so fast, their kelp have expanded 5 times in the last 5 years. The ice is retreating, but then again, as the glaciers melt, there's going to be a lot of mud and gravel going into those new kelp forests. So dive it while it's there. And like I say, it's all about, I think, balancing the wonder and the warning. You protect what you love. Unfortunately, not a lot of people get to love kelp because it's a challenging environment for diving, and fishermen like it because a lot of what they catch is in the kelp, and I like it because curious harbor seals follow me around in the acknowledgments. I said that any mistakes in this book, don't blame my editor or copy editor. It's, the fault lies completely with the flippers of those harbor seals who are so distracting. If not them, me. But I hope you read it and find not too many mistakes. And so let's go to Q&A. Thank you. And I think there's a microphone for questions. Ben.
Tell us a little bit about kelp harvesting and how it's done and how kelp is used for our diets and for other things, and how much kelp we grow in a day.
Absolutely, kelp harvesting is the question. Chapter 5 from Forest to Farms. Right now we grow 40 million tons a year of seaweed and kelp, mostly in Asia, almost all of it in China, Japan, the Koreas, some seaweeds in Indonesia. And I visited Maine and Alaska, where in Alaska I visited doing Larkart in Cordova, who's indigenous. He's Ayat, and he's growing kelp because he thinks that with the changes in the ocean, they can't guarantee that the salmon will be around forever, so he's growing kelp for his people. He also has a hunter, and he harvests both salmon and now kelp for the elders. They feed 300 elders healthy traditional foods. Up in Maine, I went out with a lobsterman who still harvesting lobster, but he's also harvesting about 60,000 pounds of kelp in the season. He's planning to harvest 100,000 pounds this year. They got to diversify. People think of Maine, lobster. Well, they were all fishermen until this century. And then because of the changes, the warming of the Gulf of Maine, and the return of kelp for other reasons, like you said, it was a perfect storm of success for the lobster. So the lobster bloomed in the 2010s. And now, as the waters are getting too warm, the lobster moving out to sea or north to Canada. So he's, he doesn't know when the lobster goes away, but he's going to be a kelp harvester and a fisherman again, going for, diversifying his catch. In terms of the main use for harvested kelp today, and 95% of it is grown, is it's a food source particularly in Asia, but also they grow for the alginate, which is, like plants, 60% of their cellular structure is cellulose. But the other 40% alginate is a great emulsifier, and since the 1920s they've used it for creamier ice creams, puddings, it's in shampoos, it's in pharmaceuticals and cosmetics, and pretty much every processed food, cosmetic, or many of the pharmaceuticals we use that contain algin. So we're all consuming kelp without knowing it. And the UN thinks that by the end of the century, kelp will be a bigger food crop than potatoes.
Are there any medical advantages that kelp produces or can produce?
Yeah, I mean, they're used in a range of pharmaceuticals, mostly as a way to deliver the drugs, the emulsifying properties, but they're also looking at different kelps, again, in terms of anti-inflammatories. A lot of seaweeds are just being looked at. Again, everything, most of our terrestrial pharmaceuticals are based on plants. We're only started in the last 20 years to really do bioprospecting in the ocean. So soft corals and various seaweeds. Other uses, they found that red algae, if you mix it as a 1% of your cattle feed, you can reduce the methane emissions from cattle, dairy and beef cattle, 60 to 90%. Burps and farts that actually, it's like, oh, it's 11% of our greenhouse gases from cattle because, we're such big meat consumers. And you can significantly reduce it with red seaweed. I visited a lab in Turkey where the guy's basically, it's not macroalgae, it's microalgae, but he's using it to generate jet fuel for Turkish Airlines. And because the lipids are not that widespread, you need to do all the fuel in America, you need we were talking about why Exxon quit the project. And anyway, saying you need a pond the size of Colorado to generate enough algae fuel to fuel the American fleet. But I suggested Texas might be better. Exxon's home state. But he's producing omega-3s, all the side products will make it profitable. And his feedstock for the algae, he's getting the CO2 from a cement company, he's getting the sugars from a fruit drink company. He's basically producing a range of products while reducing the carbon dioxide that would otherwise go in the atmosphere. And there's another one, and I thought it was funny because it's so cultural. In Norway, they have a biolab that basically takes its CO2 from an adjacent oil refinery and converts it to salmon feed for their salmon farms. And in Australia, they're making foods and cosmetics, and they're getting their carbon dioxide from a neighboring beer refinery. So I thought that was a very Australian solution. Steve?
Yeah, you already answered this question, but my ADHD requires you to say it again, which is, how much transpiration does bull kelp and the additional kelp in the oceans contribute to create, we always talk about Brazilian rainforest as transpiration for oxygen, scrubbing CO2, but how much is kicked out by bull kelp and the seaweeds in the world?
They haven't, again, it's all new. The science, the kelp science is about 10 to 20 years behind the coral science. So cumulatively, they recognize that kelp and mangroves and seagrasses are about 20% of our oxygen. But they haven't narrowed down how much kelp is generating. But we do know that kelp is declining because of all these marine heat waves. It used to be the big issues were, like in Southern California, we're basically overfishing and pollution. And same everywhere with coral, with kelp. For the last century, you overfish either the herbivores that are protecting the coral or the predators like the sea otters that are protecting the kelp. Now it's all about marine heat waves. It's just overwhelming the other factors. But again, what people don't know most of our oxygen coming from the ocean. Kelp acting as, as a protector for erosion and sea level rise. All these uses, the alginate that's in all our foods. When they got into processed foods and they took these meat pieces from the shoulder and the shank, and they weren't very edible, and they also wouldn't stay in suspension with salt or the other, and then they found alginate and would hold it together without having to freeze or cook it. So, that's the blessing of chicken nuggets. We wouldn't have them without it. David.
I'm sorry, I'm next.
Oh, sorry.
Right over here. So when I think about the oceans and where all the kelp is, so certainly there are kelp forests who are in protected marine sanctuaries. There are random kelp beds, and then there are kelp beds that are used specifically for farming. So is that correct? And is there any way that we could look at getting more of the kelp beds into a protected status so that we actually are able to maintain what we need to do?
Okay, so when I moved to San Diego in the 70s, Kelco was there, and they had their harvesting boats that would cut off the top 4 feet of the Point Melati kelp bed and collect about 500 tons a day. They had 4 ships, so they're collecting 2,000 tons a day, more or less. Today, 95% of all seaweed and kelp harvesting is farmed, is aquaculture. So, unfortunately, the other 5% is in northern Chile and southern Peru, where organized crime has hired a bunch of displaced migrants from Venezuela and Haiti and everywhere else to go out and tear out the kelp forest there. And because of a lot of corruption, it's all being exported to China for the alginate market. So that's the story I didn't get to do, but I'd like to still go down. And they say the northern Chile desert's like the Wild West. But most of it that used to be farmed out of the wild is now farmed domestically. And this is, I think it's good. 10,000 years ago we had the agricultural revolution. A lot of good, a lot of bad. We've gone from 6 trillion trees to 3 trillion trees, according to the LiDAR satellite surveys. Growing kelp is like no inputs, no synthetic chemicals. It grows like bamboo. It's full of nutrients. You can also use the algae. You don't need to be taking fish oil or krill oil for your omega-3. They all get their omega-3 from eating algae, so we could too. Also, you won't get the fish burps after.
I was wondering how you feel about Stinson Beach. If the bull kelp is coming back, it was totally gone for so long, and now it seems to be coming back a bit. But is anybody doing some studies right here on Stinson Beach?
Right.
What?
I didn't hear the last part.
Oh, I just wondered about the kelp on Stinson Beach.
On Stinson
It
Beach.
disappeared, and now it's coming back a bit.
There's a bit of recovery. Everybody's making a big deal with the kelp's back off of Mendocino.
Yeah.
But, the kelp off Mendocino town was the last kelp to be eaten by the urchin. And when they remove the urchin, it's the first kelp to come back. Well, you've got the river right there.
Yeah.
And I think urchins don't like fresh water, so that's probably why we're getting such rebound off of Mendocino. Northern California is not, and the problem is, people are collaborating like never before. Fishermen and scientists and environmentalists working together. I went out in Casper Cove with, the hammers smashing urchins. But you're getting an acre here and an acre there. And the theory is you bring back the coves and then the spore might go out and restore the long coastal kelp forest of the past, but we're not seeing it yet. The giant kelp's coming back in Central and Southern California. It's a more successful story. In Monterey, when the sea stars went away, the otters were like, oh, are you not gonna eat that? They just went wild and, ate all the urchins that otherwise the sea star. This scientist down in Australia said, I'm really jealous. He says, we have our predators are like, lobster and big fish, but the PR gods gave you those marine weasels, and so you have the otters.
Hey, David, could you talk a little bit about the Kelp Highway and its, the resource for marine mammals and moving up and down the coast, the otters and the whales and the fisheries along the coast?
Yeah, and the people. I just wrote a piece for American Indian Magazine, which is the magazine of the National Museum of the American Indian, Smithsonian, on herring roe on kelp. It's herring roe on kelp and cedar bushes that they also put out there, which has been indigenous food, the first food of spring for, since time immemorial, at least since humans arrived. And it's big spring food, it's creamy, and it's, and it's like pop rocks, they say, and it's the first sign of spring. And, the one indigenous cultures do have a history of storytelling about the kelp. Not a lot of other people recognize its importance, but it's been vital to coastal tribes up and down the coast, and also been a source of foods for whales and others. And as I say, I got a whole chapter on the sea otters. But anyway, but it's all in the book, which is for sale over there, and then we'll have the boat open for touring. So one or two more questions.
Hi. Can you speak to the abalone population and how it's dependent upon kelp? I know that they're in trouble.
Yes, in fact, I have a chapter called Hand Fried to Extinction, all about the story of the abalone and the white abalone getting too delicious, and lots of, let me just read you something. Because it is part of the California culture. At this stage, visibility is not even that big an issue for me. Hand fried to extinction. So George Sterling was the sort of the Shakespeare of abalone. Some think that the Lord is fat and some that he is bony, but as for me, I think that he is like an abalone. This was the abalone song that the Bohemians used to sit around. We sit around and pound, but not with acrimony, because our object is a gob of sizzling abalone. So yeah, the kelp is supported the abalone. The abalone live on kelp, and when the kelp went away, they shut down the free diving recreational season for abalone free diving in 2018, which brought $20 to $30 million a year to Northern California. And I've collected several abalone shells since I started writing this book, because there's a lot of shells and not a lot of abalone left. And I mean, we were overfishing it long before, as I say, hand fried to extinction. It's delicious, and there was this false belief that that broadcast spawners like mollusks couldn't be overfished. But turns out if you're not within 3 feet of another abalone, you're not going to reproduce. So I think, because this is supposed to be a book talk, I should just end with the end of my book.
We have one more question.
Oh, okay. One more question, and then the final short read.
I just have a question about this sea vegetable that is served under my oysters. Is this related to kelp?
I don't know what they're serving. That looks like some species of seaweed. I mean, there are about 30 species of kelp and 12,000 other species of seaweed. So you'd have to ask the chef.
Okay.
But so, and I end the last chapter is called Triage for the Ocean, and towards the end of it, I say, I don't want to leave you with. Halfway through it, I say, if you're tired of doom scrolling, read another 3 pages. And then I talk to Sylvia Earle, who always has a very positive spin on it. Plus, she started with seaweed, so her career. Sylvia, how many of you know who Sylvia Earle is? Okay, well, and again, you're an unrepresentative group because we're here at the yacht club. But usually, if she's basically the Jane Goodall of the ocean, but because Jane Goodall was of the land, everybody knows who she is, and not as many people know Sylvia. But I talked to Sylvia, and the end of her interview, I say, also we have to be this is Sylvia talking, we have to be a voice, a communicator, witness, whatever, for the forests of why we care, why we want to restore and protect it. Why should someone care that the forests of Borneo are burning, that the undersea forests are collapsing, that about half are now lost? If you think about warming water, land, and the planet, we have to consider how you live your life in terms of the carbon cycle, and we're pushing it beyond what natural systems can accommodate. We're altering the nature of nature, and we have to begin to restore life. It's simply vital to our world's health and our own. At which point I discovered she hasn't eaten all day, having just finished being interviewed by one film crew and about to be interviewed by another at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So I run across the street and buy veggie burgers and fries for everyone. Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci once wrote about a practical way to move forward in this life: pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And then he died in a fascist prison. Nonetheless, I believe that the seaweed rebels who've entangled their lives with macroalgae, immersing themselves in the science, restoration, protection, and digestion of the world's kelp forests, will in the end protect what they love, eat well, and die trying. We might even suggest that if we become stewards of the most basic building blocks of life, including algae and cyanobacteria, they may help us begin to heal the world. After all, like algae, we all come from salt water on both an individual and evolutionary basis. And as Isaac Dinesen wrote, the cure for anything is salt water, sweat, tears, or the sea. So when you return to the source, when you explore the dark, mysterious, and enchanting forest of the sea, you're also returning home to reconnect to the wonder and scary sacred wildness that is both within you and around you. It can also be cold, wet, and awesome. It's like a large, fast-moving shadow in the kelp when there's only 6 feet of visibility. And you think, hey, wait, what is that? It's life.
Well, David, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, again, the books are available. It officially is published on May the 5th. Queen is here. Feel free to tour. It's a beautiful book. We'll see you next month. Thank you.
Yeah.